welcome everyone to tonight's After Hours. My name is Candace Vinson. I am the Outreach and Events Coordinator here at VIMS. Our lecture tonight will be given by Dr. Matt Kirwan. Dr. Kirwan received his BS from William & Mary and his PhD from Duke University. His work currently focuses on applying the concepts of ecogeomorphology to better understand carbon-climate feedback in the coastal zone, the response of wetlands to sea level rise, enhanced CO2 and elevated temperatures, and how humans influence wetlands through upland use change and its effect on wetland migration and sediment delivery to the coast. I asked Dr. Kirwan to share a fun fact with me for everyone tonight, and he said that his ancestors have been in the Chesapeake Bay region for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And tonight he also just shared with me another fun fact. He turned 40 yesterday. So please help me welcome and say happy birthday to Dr. Matt Kirwan. Dr. Kirwan?
Thank you very much, Candace. 40 years old. I'm getting too old for seminars. No, I'm just kidding. It's actually quite an honor to be with everybody tonight. I'm overwhelmed with how many people are on the other end of this, and I wish so bad we were all here in person together to talk about ghost forests. When I first started at VIMS, 7 years ago, I was asked to do a after hours presentation pretty much when I first arrived, and so I went to another one and sort of checked them out and realized very quickly how high quality most of the after hours presentations are, and I was so intimidated I didn't think I had anything worth saying, and so I've stalled and this is now my first one, and so I'm pleased to say it. My opinion has changed. I think after 7 years I finally have something that's worth talking about, and that I think and hope you will find interesting. Candace gave a nice introduction to myself, but I also wanted to introduce myself and the topic one more way, and that's with two pictures on this title slide showing the place on the Eastern Shore where most of my ancestors come from. The picture down in the bottom right corner shows a modern day ghost forest. You can see all the dead trees that represent the ghost forest where forests used to be, that's now occupied by marsh. And that's a ghost forest that I've personally watched evolve over the last 10 or 20 years. But then the picture on the left is one that's even more special. The picture on the left shows my kids where my great-great-grandparents used to live and their ancestors before them. And what's really striking about this picture is that when my great-great-grandparents lived there, this land was dry, usable land. Some of my grandparents' neighbors grew strawberries on it until the 1960s. And now it's, as you can tell in the picture, it's a salt marsh. And so things in the Chesapeake region are changing quickly. There's lots of examples of land that's becoming inundated, changing the type of plants that grow there, and in some cases converting dry land to wetlands. And that's really what this talk is about. It's a little mix of stories like that with some science and a lot of photographs illustrating some of the changes that are striking to me, and I hope that you'll find them interesting as well. I thought I would really start the presentation with a video that's available on YouTube now. It is a video about ghost forests that was incorporated into an article in Time magazine. When you see a ghost forest for the first time, you're struck by how eerie it is, sort of like a ghost town. This ground is now too salty and too wet to support living trees. One of the best indicators of climate change anywhere in the world is you see pictures of where a glacier was 100 years ago, and then you see a picture of it now, and the glacier has retreated a mile. But here we've got dead trees that mark where the land was 10, 20, 50 years ago. And so they're the most striking indicator that I know of climate change anywhere on the East Coast. But only recently have scientists been documenting how fast they're dying and how fast the forest is retreating. When the tree was young, it was growing very fast. These rings are spread wide apart. And then as the tree became older and probably subject to more salt and waterlogged soils, now the tree rings are really, really small. So this tree is barely growing now. This vigorous, thick shrub layer is actually one of the first indicators that a forest is in trouble. And at this point, we've transitioned from being in a forest to actually being in a real full-fledged marsh. The rate of forest retreat has accelerated. It's tripled or quadrupled over the last 100 years. And that acceleration in the forest retreat can be attributed directly to climatic-driven rising sea levels. People like some of my family members have watched the marsh encroaching closer and closer to their house every year from a combination of factors, both economic and I would say climatic. People in this community have moved out through time, and it's left behind a lot of things like this church, like the schoolhouse down the road, a lot of the homes you see here. They're all memories of what the place used to look like. And in a lot of ways, the trees are telling us that those same memories. The trees are showing us what the land used to look like. Every few decades, that rate accelerates. And I think the formation of the ghost forests will continue to accelerate. And if you either don't know your history or don't pay real close attention, in 100 years, you might not know that a forest was ever here. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that video. And I thought that video did a really nice job of capturing the essence of what ghost forests look like. And it scratches the surface of the science behind how they form and how coastal landscapes are becoming more inundated. But it also only tells part of the story. And so one of my goals for the next 30 or 40 minutes or so is to tell you a more complete picture about ghost forests and to tell you how scientists are working to better understand when and where different parts of our coastal region might submerge. My first goal is really to try to express just how widespread these ghost forests are. Once you've seen them once and noticed them, you'll see them in a lot more places. This picture here is from the eastern shore of Maryland, where that video was filmed. But they're also right here in Gloucester County. This is a picture of the Catalet Islands on the York River, just north of Gloucester Point, showing a lot of dead red cedars in the middle of this little marsh island surrounded by marsh. This is a picture from the eastern shore of Virginia, Northampton County, near Brownsville, where again, there's ghost forests, this time consisting mostly of dead loblolly pine trees. Loblolly pine and eastern red cedars are the most salt-tolerant trees in the Chesapeake region, so they're the ones that are growing close to the marsh, and they're the ones that typically form these ghost forests. This is kind of a neat picture just north of, well, just outside of Wachapreague, really, in Accomack County. And this is a picture I took, and for the life of me, I couldn't remember where I'd taken it from. I wrote Northampton County on the picture itself because that was a safe bet, but I really couldn't remember where I took it. And then I went to Wachapreague to do a seminar at the Eastern Shore Lab. And on the way, I stopped to see somebody that had invited me to come look at some of the ghost forests near his house. And lo and behold, this was his property. And I had developed, before I knew the history of the site, I developed a whole story about how this had formed. I said, it sort of looks like an old farm that got too wet and it grew up into trees, and then the trees eventually died as well. So I'd come up with this whole story, but then the gentleman that lives next to this ghost forest told me that actually that's pretty close to what happened in reality as well. That was a neat experience. This is another picture of Gloucester County, and the point of this picture is to show that the same processes that form ghost forests are also influencing other types of land. This is a farm in the Guinea section of Gloucester County off of Perrin River Road, and it shows a very salt-stressed soybean field. This is a picture probably taken in late summer, and the green areas in the picture are healthy soybeans. The yellow and reds are very stressed and stunted soybeans. And then the white color, believe it or not, that's actually salt that's accumulating at the edge of the field. You can see it in particular up in this inset picture on the screen. That farmland is plowed and planted every year. It almost never grows a crop at the edge of the fields. And if anything, the edges are growing, and there's more and more area of farmland along the edges being lost each year. I fear that over the next, we'll just say few decades, because I don't know how long it will take, that farmland might have the same fate as the farmland in the next picture, shown right here. This is a farm in Somerset County on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, where the farm has been in the hands of the same family since an original King's Grant, and has been productive up until the last 10 or 15 years or so. This farmer's standing in what used to be a soybean field, and he's lost 15 acres of good farmland to saltwater intrusion and increasing inundation on his land. So this is a process that's not just affecting forests, but is also affecting trees. I mean, not just affecting forests, but also affecting farmland and people themselves that depend on farmland and forest land. I've got two more pictures that I wanted to show to continue this theme of showing how widespread the ghost forests are. They're particularly abundant in the Chesapeake region. The biggest ones that I've ever seen are in the Chesapeake region, but they really stretch up and down the Atlantic coast of North America. This is a red spruce ghost forest in New Brunswick, Canada. I like this picture because it shows not only the ghost forest in the background, but also these little stumps out in the marsh that are the last remnant of the forest that used to be there. And then if you could think of a type of ghost forest that would be the exact opposite of a red spruce ghost forest, this next picture shows a palm tree ghost forest, which I think is the coolest thing ever. You can see normal looking palm trees and then palm trees without their tops right there. And this is from the Florida Gulf Coast. So the point of this long introduction is essentially that ghost forests are widespread, and that the changes that we see in places like Gloucester County are actually happening in many other places in the United States and many other places in North America. So I've got a couple other points that I'd like to try to make today. And the second one is essentially how ghost forests form. And the first question that I get from most people is simply, what kills the trees? And I wish so bad we were all together in person, because if we were, I would look out over the audience and ask each one of you what kills the trees. And I'd give you two options. I'd say, is it storms that kill the trees, or is it long-term gradual flooding and saltwater intrusion that kills the trees? Essentially, does this happen all at once, or does it happen gradually over time? And of course, there's a whole series of other factors. And while some people would say that that it's a combination of all the factors, and they'd be right to a certain extent, my attempt to answer this question is going to be a little bit different. One of the big things that forest ecologists have learned about ghost forests can be summarized in the two pictures shown on this screen. The picture on the left is a big old loblolly pine tree. It's actually in my backyard. If I look over the top of my laptop screen, I can see it right now. Right now, it's not flooded, but in this picture, it's clearly flooded. I'm on Timberneck Creek, so this is pretty salty water, not quite full strength seawater, but definitely salt water. And this tree floods, I would say, about 10 times a year, but yet it is alive and all the needles are green. It at least looks healthy. Now, the picture on the right has a similar message in that adult trees are fairly resistant to sea level rise and fairly resistant to salts and inundation. Again, the picture on the right is probably inundated maybe 10 times a year, and it still has trees. These don't look quite so healthy, but the adult trees are there and they're alive. What's really important about that picture, though, is what's underneath those trees. Normally in a healthy loblolly pine forest, if there's a gap in the canopy, like you could see in that picture on the right, the forest floor would be just covered with a carpet of little green loblolly pine seedlings, hundreds of them. And yet in this picture, we have exactly one. And I bet that one seedling has died since I took that picture 10 years ago. So these two pictures together tell a really important story, and that is that seedlings are more sensitive to salt water than adult trees. And this is kind of a general ecological principle that that young individuals are more sensitive than adults. You know, it's certainly true in children, it's true in most animals and most organisms. And in the case of forestry, or in the case of forest ecology, what it implies is that the forest, that the seedlings will be killed before the trees. And so that if you want to look at the state of the ecosystem, or especially if you want to tell the state of the future, you look to the understory layer, not the adult trees. And so if we go back to answering this question, what kills the trees? Is it storms, or is it gradual saltwater intrusion? I would argue that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what kills the adult trees. It matters what kills the seedlings, which is essentially all of the above. They're very sensitive, and more importantly, that many forests that you might look at are essentially dead before the trees die. Other people have described this as the forest is dead before it even knows it. It doesn't matter whether you can see the canopy of these trees to know whether they're alive or not, because you can look to the understory and there's nothing to take its place. So like many things, the future lies in our children. The future of this forest lies in its ability to generate, to regenerate and recruit new individuals. And in this case, seedlings are very sensitive to salts. So the whole process looks something like this. This is a picture, again, back on the eastern shore of Maryland. This is actually looking out of one of my deer stands. The picture is really characterized, or it really represents the current marsh forest boundary where the ghost forest is just starting to form. You've got a mix of both living trees as well as dead trees in the canopy. You've got a really vigorous shrub layer that's starting to come in, like we saw in that YouTube video. And then you also have some marsh grasses, both native Spartina patens and invasive Phragmites australis, starting to occupy and move into where that forest used to be. This is actually kind of an old picture. Now this system has evolved, and it looks a little bit more like this. This is the state of a ghost forest maybe 10 or 20 years into the future, where now all of the adult trees are dead. There's not a single live tree out here. And instead of shrubs in the understory, there's a continuous healthy marsh underneath it. And then in another 20 years or so, another 20 years or so, that forest might look like this, where the only remnant, the only memory of the tree, of the forest that used to be there, are the stumps that are soon to be buried by the marsh. So that in a nutshell is how ghost forests form. It starts with mortality. It starts with death to the seedlings, followed by death of the adult trees, and then the gradual migration and invasion of the understory by marsh processes as that soil becomes more inundated and more salty. Now, the YouTube video made a big deal about the role of climate change in the expansion of ghost forests, both in the Chesapeake Bay and beyond. And I often say that ghost forests are the single most striking indicator of climate change anywhere on the East Coast. And I'd actually probably argue that they're as good of indicators of climate change as anything else that we see, maybe even in the world. And that's more or less the quote that I've put on this slide on the bottom. But I want to contrast that with an earlier quote. This is the first reference that I know of to retreating coastal forests or dead trees at the margin of marshes that I know of. It's from 1910. And the point of this is that essentially ghost forests were described at least as early as 1910. All of my oldest ancestors say that we've always had dead trees at the edge of marshes. Most of the older people that I talk to would agree with that statement. And so I want to bring up this contrast because it's another one that people often ask me about. How do you know that this is a climate-driven process? Is it natural or is it climate-driven? What's different now than the way things used to look 50 years ago or 100 years ago? And to answer that question, you really have to move beyond the personal stories and the family history and things like that. This is where science has a big role. So let me give you a couple pieces of information. The first is a reconstruction of sea level in the mid-Atlantic region over the last 400 years. And if you wanted to, you could extend this reconstruction to several more hundred years. The y-axis shows the relative sea level. The x-axis shows time. Relative sea level is the contribution of both the water actually rising as well as the land sinking. So it's a well-known fact around here, especially in the Chesapeake region, that our land is sinking. That causes water to rise or to make it look like it's rising. And then the water itself is actually rising too. Those two things combined are are what we call relative sea level rise. And this graph illustrates really two things. The first is that relative sea level has been rising for at least several hundred years, and you could extend this much further back. That means that as long as the land is sinking and the water is rising, that you would expect to see marsh migrating into upland forests. And so the fact that we were seeing sea level rise 100 years ago, 200 years ago, is fully consistent with the statement or the quotation from Forrest Shreve describing ghost forests over 100 years ago. But the second thing that this graph illustrates is the sea level rise rates today and over the last century have been much faster than they were in the recent past. In fact, somewhere around 1850 to 1900, corresponding to the Industrial Revolution, sea level rise rates essentially tripled. And you would expect, if sea level rise is driving the formation of ghost forests, that ghost forests should also be expanding at faster rates today than they were in the past. And that's a nice, testable scientific hypothesis. Are ghost forests occurring more prominently? Are they migrating faster now than they were in the past? So to answer that question, I want to show you some work that my former master's student, Natalie has done. She looked at ghost forests across 5 sites in the mid-Atlantic, ranging from the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge on the eastern shore of Maryland, down to 2 sites in eastern North Carolina, and then, of course, Goodwin Island here on the York River, close to home. She examined and reconstructed historical rates of forest retreat through a couple different ways. The easiest way is just looking at old maps and photographs. There's really good old maps from the 1850s But she really wanted to go further back than that. And so she used sediment cores from all of these sites to reconstruct rates of forest retreat that are actually in some cases over the last 2,000 years. And then she compared those retreat rates to what she observed today in modern photographs. So this is a picture of what the fieldwork looks like. You can see Natalie back here carrying all the sediment cores. You can see a technician of ours, David Walters, taking the notes, which means I'm left to take the pictures and generally take it easy. I'm 40 years old now, after all. So the picture at the bottom shows what one of these sediment cores looks like. And it turns out you can actually really easily tell how the forest has retreated through time in these photographs, in the sediment cores. The colors on the left side of this core are really dark brown, almost black, organic rich sediment. That characterizes marsh. The sediment below that, in the bottom half of this core, is a light brown color. It has almost no plant roots in it. It's composed of clays and in some cases some sand, and it represents where the forest was. And so if you're taking a core into what's marsh now, if you go deep enough, you can find where the marsh replaced the forest. And I would draw that contact somewhere around right here. Once you know where that contact is, you can radiometrically date the time where the marsh replaced the forest. And if you do that enough times, you can come up with a chronology or a time series of how the marsh has replaced forest or how the forest has retreated through time. And that's exactly what Natalie did. This is one graph summarizing her results. She's got two colors here. One is the migration rate pre-1875, and one is the forest retreat rate post-1875. 1875 really represents when sea level rise rates started accelerating. And so in every single case, at all 5 of her sites, she noticed that forest retreat rates now are much faster than they used to be, much, much faster. And she saw that at all 5 sites, which means that it's really hard to explain that by, let's say, the effects of Hurricane Isabel, which were strong on the eastern shore, but not so strong in coastal North Carolina. Or it would be hard to explain it by a forest fire or an insect outbreak or any other kind of processes that might influence the retreat of forests at one in particular site. The important thing here is that the accelerated forest retreat was consistent over a huge section of the mid-Atlantic coast. This is another look at the same data set that Natalie put together. Now, instead of just comparing really old migration rates to more recent migration rates, she shows migration rates every couple decades through time. And what she sees in most cases is that migration rates in the early 1900s were kind of slow, and that through most decadal intervals, this is a really good example here, that migration rates accelerated. So not only are migration rates faster than they were 200 years ago, but they're increasing, the forest is retreating at ever faster rates. In other words, the forest retreat rates are continuing to accelerate with sea level rise. Now, I didn't really show you the timing of when this acceleration began, but suffice it to say that the timing of forest acceleration, of forest retreat at all 5 of these sites was almost perfectly synchronous with the timing of sea level acceleration, which is, again, strong evidence that even though we've had ghost forests in the Chesapeake region for many, many years, that the processes driving it are climatic related, and that warmer temperatures leads to faster sea level rise, which leads to faster coastal forest retreat rates. Now, the final bit of the story that I wanted to share with you, and this is where I think that the YouTube video didn't do a good job of capturing, is that ghost forests are actually a surprising sign of ecological resilience. And the main reason that I say this is that beneath all of those dead trees are these beautiful marshes that are replacing them. And most ecologists would value wetland vegetation over forest vegetation. 2/3 of the state of Virginia is forested. I would say maybe 2% of Virginia's land area is occupied by marshes. So we simply have a lot more forests than we have marshes. And then marshes also provide lots of ecosystem services. They improve our water quality, they sequester carbon, they protect us from storms, all sorts of good things. And so there's an argument to be made here that while inundation of land is bad for the people that live here, which is like illustrated in this picture of this picture of somebody's front yard. And I really hate taking pictures of people's yards to show everybody else how bad this problem is. But the silver lining here is that even though this process can be bad for people, there's an argument to be made that it's a sign of ecological resilience. So this is a picture of that marsh that's forming underneath the dead trees. This is a video that illustrates some of the concepts that I'm trying to explain. This is a video shot by a drone that we flew over Goodwin Island. Goodwin Island is an island out in the middle of the York River, just outside of Yorktown. And the island as a whole is eroding. It's exposed to waves on all sides. The area of the island has shrunk dramatically over the last couple hundred years. The marshes on the island are not doing particularly well. You can see places where the marshes are getting ponds in them. They're transitioning to open water. But despite all of that, and this is really shocking to a lot of people, despite the island as a whole getting smaller and the loss of some marshes in the interior, marshes on Goodwin Island have actually gotten bigger over the last 100 years. And that's because sea level rise also causes the formation of marshes. Now, I paused the video right here at a very key time step. I paused it here because everything you're going to see from now on is marsh that formed within the last 150 years. And most of it is marsh that formed within the last 50 years. So now we're flying over areas that we know were forest. They show up as forest in aerial photographs. We can see the forest in our sediment cores. And in some cases, we see even the remains of the dead trees. And in all cases, there's marsh underneath it. Some of it's not particularly good marsh. Some of it's Phragmites. Some of it's native Spartina patens. But the point here is that there's at least marsh of some kind. So I'm going to continue flying over. By this point, all the marsh here has formed easily within the last 50 years. Now we're probably into the last 30 years. And the video kind of stops here where probably this marsh formed in the last 10 years or 20 years or so. So I think that's a really striking example of how sea level rise doesn't always lead to loss of marsh. In some cases, it can lead to creation of new marsh. And in the case of Goodwin Island, it's led to marsh expansion. And that process doesn't work everywhere. That process could not work if Goodwin Island were a very developed system. The fact that you see ghost forests is a sign that you're allowing nature to take its course. It's a sign that ecosystems are migrating. And in some cases, it's a sign that people are migrating as well. Another question that I'm often asked is simply, is there enough undeveloped land that marshes could survive sea level rise by migrating into upland forests? Can ghost forests save the marshes of the Chesapeake Bay? To try to address that question, Natalie did another research project where she looked at a lot of historical maps from the 1850s. These maps were actually of incredibly high quality. They showed where farmland was in this, that's the lightest colored. They showed where forest was, that's this color. And they showed where marshland was in this color. And then of course, open water as well. This is a map of Gloucester County, lower Gloucester County, by the way, showing the Guinea and Bena parts of the county. And what it allowed Natalie to do was trace where all of the marshes were in 1850, and then compare that to where the marshes were in much more recent imagery, more or less today, and then create maps that show where we've lost marsh, that's the blue colors, where we've gained marsh, that's this color, and then of course where nothing has changed, which is the darker red color. And what Natalie found is that summed over the extent of the entire Chesapeake Bay, she found that over 100,000 acres of uplands had converted to marshland just in the last 150 years. That's actually enough to explain the formation of about a third of all of the Chesapeake Bay marshes. About a third of them formed in the last 150 years due to this very process. It's also enough to compensate for historical erosion of the marshes. This figure on the right shows the net change in the size of a marsh on a percentage basis for a bunch of different historical maps across the Chesapeake Bay. And one of the things I want to stress is that there's some places where the marshes have been completely eroded, like Tangier Island, for example. There's no uplands left for marshes to migrate into, and so there's erosion that leads to marsh loss. But there's other places, especially around the mouth of the York River, where marshes have actually expanded. And then if you average that all across the Chesapeake Bay, on average, roughly, marsh migration is roughly compensated for marsh erosion. So at least historically, this process has worked. It has allowed marshes to survive sea level rise in a region where we have really fast sea level rise rates, and in a region where we also have people living near the coast. Now, I alluded a second ago to the fact that this process would not work everywhere else, and that ghost forests are a sign that nature is taking its course. You almost never see ghost forests in Europe. You almost never see ghost forests in Southeast Asia. And you almost never see ghost forests even in the United States near very populated cities. And the reason is because in those places, we don't allow the coast to evolve naturally. We have cities right next to water, and they're separated by features like this dike that prevent the marsh from migrating into the forest. It prevents forests or farmland from being inundated by salt water. And so where you see the ghost forests is actually a sign of that ecosystems, and in some cases, people are migrating inland. And they are, in a nutshell, a sign of nature taking its course. That's not necessarily a good thing. The picture on the bottom right here shows a church with a massive ghost forest behind it. The cemetery here, you can't really tell from the picture, but it's essentially, that's not regular grass that you would plant in your yard. That's a marsh that's being mowed. And the inundation of these coastal communities, in many cases, like in the case of my ancestors, has led to the complete demise or populations have moved out and communities have fallen apart. So I don't want to leave you entirely with a positive conclusion. What's good for the marsh and what's good for nature isn't always what's good for us. In any case, I want to leave you with three conclusions. One, ghost forests are a widespread, striking indicator of climate change. Rural Chesapeake coast is what makes marsh migration possible, and marsh migration and ghost forest formation come with a human cost, but I would argue are also a surprising sign of ecological resilience. So thank you very much for coming tonight. I would love to take some of your questions, and I would especially love to hear some of your stories about changes that you've seen take place, personal stories that you might have that illustrate some of these processes, or alternatively, stories that might show places where my understanding is incomplete. So thank you very much, and I'd be glad to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kirwan. We had a couple of questions in the chat, and I also wanted to take this time to make sure we thank our sponsors: First Advantage Federal Credit Union, Dominion Energy, Chesapeake Bank, Hog Funeral Home, Langley Federal Credit Union, and Whitley's Peanut Factory. And so our first question comes from Ladorna in the chat. She asks, is saltwater intrusion from groundwater? How do you date core radiometric shells?
We don't radiometrically date shells. Shells can be problematic for a couple reasons. One is you have to date them using carbon-14, which is a little bit less precise than the lead-210 methods that we commonly use. Shells also, depending on what the organism is, might not occur they don't occur right at the marsh forest boundary for sure. They would be good at dating like the timing of a mud flat forming, for example. But we're much more concerned with the sediment that's right there at the contact between marsh and forest in the sediment cores. And for that, we can sometimes use carbon-14 dating, and then a lot of times use lead-210 methods. All right, I see the chats now. Thanks for the happy birthday wishes, by the way. Oh, okay. The other part of that question was is saltwater intrusion from groundwater? It's all of the above. Saltwater can come in through the ground. It can come in from the tides. Most of the pictures I show you are, I think, driven by just tidal flooding. In other words, water that's coming in off the surface rather than through the ground. If anything, it's the fresh water in the groundwater that's helping some of those trees survive. But certainly both processes could work. All right, there's a question about swamp growth rates versus loss. How about sediments deposited near York River mouth versus the Matthews County losses, erosion, and alongside the bay where I grew up? All right, so first of all, wave erosion occurs anywhere you have waves, and the bigger waves you have, the faster it occurs. This is kind of basic stuff, but if you are on the banks of the Chesapeake Bay proper, say in the far eastern ends of Matthews County, you've got the whole bay to work with, so waves get really big and erode really fast. You have that to a lesser extent on the York River, but the York River is a little smaller, so the waves are a little smaller and the erosion rates are also a little bit smaller. Now, the only thing that can really compensate for erosion is deposition of sediment. So the person asking this question was mentioning sediments deposited near the York River mouth. You very often, whether you're talking about little creeks flowing into a big river or a big river flowing into the Chesapeake Bay, where small water meets big water, the water sort of spreads out and you often get sediment deposition. And so that's why you would have sediment deposited near the York River mouth. You still certainly have erosion in places along the York River, but it's why that, together with the size of the waves, is why you'd have more erosion perhaps where you grew up on the Chesapeake Bay portion of Matthews County than the York River. All right, the next question I see is, how is marsh migration and community impact being mitigated or plans for mitigation by state or local governments? Right now, as far as I know, state and local governments don't exactly plan for it. I mean, there's maps certainly of places where land is going to become inundated, but as far as I know, there are no policies that allow the state or local government to then act upon that knowledge. Now, there's some unintentional ways that lead, sort of in effect, lead to mitigation. For example, the restrictions associated with Chesapeake Bay Act zones where you can't build within 100 feet of a wetland, for example, that unintentionally leads to preservation of the land that otherwise or that will eventually become marsh. So it's kind of an indirect way. Now, while state and local governments aren't actively mitigating for this, as far as I know, and I might be wrong about that. That's not my field of expertise. Nonprofit groups absolutely are, and actually federal government landowners are. So, like the Nature Conservancy is very active in protecting and in some cases purchasing land that's forest land today for the sake of ensuring that they have marsh in the future. Fish and wildlife refuges like the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge is at the forefront of this as well. And it's really it's an exciting development in ecosystem restoration. Normally, when you're talking about restoring or protecting ecosystems, you're protecting what's there now or what used to be there, and you're trying to restore it to make it resemble what used to be there. This is one of the few cases I know in environmental management where you're protecting a system not for the sake of what's there now or what used to be there, but for the sake of what is going to be there in the future. And I think that's really interesting. And there are lots of government and nonprofit groups that are working along those lines. Okay, next question is, while there are signs of ecological resistance, how long will that last with sea level rise? The short, unsatisfying answer is that will depend on location. So if you're in a place where the uplands are relatively steep, or you're in a place where there are dikes and seawalls built around the edge of the marsh, this ecological resilience process won't last long at all. On the other hand, if you're in a place with really gradual slopes and not too many people, then this process might last for a really long time. One statistic that I really like that I didn't have time to share today is that in coastal Louisiana, where about half of the nation's wetlands are located, in coastal Louisiana, there is almost exactly as much land that will be inundated by 1 meter of sea level rise as land that is currently marsh. And so the implication there is, and that statistic, by the way, takes into account for the levees around New Orleans and the other big cities. But that suggests that we could go to 2100, and even if we lost every single marsh in Louisiana, that there would be potential at least for marshes to persist just because they're forming in other places. The other caveat of all this is that where you have a marsh today isn't necessarily where you have a marsh in the future. So some places will lose all their marshes, some places will get even bigger marshes. All right, next question is marsh expansion due to sea level rise a result of other types of land like forests turning into marsh? Yes, that is, in a nutshell, probably the most important point that I tried to express today. Yes, the marsh expansion due to sea level rise is absolutely other types of land turning into marsh, and it's typically forest land. All right, next question is, could you explain in layman's terms the difference between good marsh and bad marsh? Yeah, I use those terms pretty loosely. And I suppose you could define those a lot of different ways. Some people might define it as native versus invasive, where the bad marsh would be the invasive marsh, that's the Phragmites, versus good marsh, which is native Spartina or other species. I think we ought to do a little bit better than that. I think we should talk about ecosystem services and what good that marsh is to us in terms of, or what good that marsh is to animals, and what good it is as habitat. So to me, a good marsh would be a marsh that is good for a wide variety of animals, a marsh that is good at sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere, is good at improving water quality, all of those things. And then actually in some cases, Phragmites meets a lot of those definitions. It's very good at sequestering carbon. It's very good at taking nitrogen out of the water. It's not particularly good habitat anyway, that gives you a sense of good and bad. And of course, those definitions ultimately depend on who you're talking to. And this is where I think the state of the science is. I think at this point, we know that forest land is converting to marshland in lots of different places, and that it's an important process. We also know that it's going to become even more important with accelerated sea level rise in the future. And so I think the frontier of this field of study really is, what are the ecological consequences of it? And is the marsh that's forming good enough to replace the marsh that is eroded and submerged in other places? All right, we're getting close to the end of the list of the questions that I can see. The next one is, when it comes to barrier islands like Jekyll Island in Georgia and the Driftwood Beach area, is that considered a ghost forest, even though I've been told it's been created by the currents reforming the islands? I wasn't sure if that's quite the same phenomenon. You can certainly call them ghost forests. People will refer to ghost forests in some cases to trees that were killed by insects. I've seen gypsy moth forests killed by gypsy moths called ghost forests. There's a lot of places out on the western coast, on the Pacific coast, where ghost forests were killed by tsunamis thousands of years ago. They call those ghost forests. So you can certainly call them ghost forests. But the key difference is that the ones that you're mentioning and on other barrier islands are not formed by sea level rise. They're formed by coastal erosion. They're formed by currents reforming the island, like you said. And that's a different process than the gradual increasing salt content of soils that's killing the ghost forests that I shared with you today. So you can call them ghost forests, just know that it's a different process that's forming them. And you would not want to use those as your gold standard for a indicator of climate change. All right. Another question is, what role, if any, do non-native species such as Phragmites and Nutria play in marsh resilience or vulnerability? We touched on the fact that Phragmites is the most, maybe I didn't say it, it is the most common species that's invading ghost forests in the mid-Atlantic. And in terms of its influence on marsh resilience, especially marsh resilience to sea level rise, I think more work needs to be done on that. But if anything, Phragmites is probably a good thing in terms of marsh resilience to sea level rise. It produces massive, massive roots that add volume to the soil. In effect, it allows the soil to become higher in elevation. Therefore, it works against sea level rise. So one way to survive sea level rise is for the marsh soil to build vertically through time, and Phragmites is very good at allowing or facilitating the marsh to grow vertically, increase its height through time. The other question was about Nutria and the role that they play in marsh vulnerability. Nutria, of course, are very devastating to the marsh. They eat both the top of the plant and the bottom of the plant, and they're like muskrat on steroids, I'd say. They cause big eat-outs of a marsh. They convert vegetation to open water that in many cases never grows back. In my opinion, the Nutria they're the sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back. The best example of Nutria leading to marsh loss is in the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, which is where a lot of these photographs were from. And those marshes, for a variety of reasons, were going to be lost to sea level rise anyway. The sediment, there's not much sediment in the water. The tides are really irregular. Anyway, we won't go into those reasons. All that's to say is that those marshes are extremely vulnerable to sea level rise in the first place. And then the mechanisms that marshes do have to respond to sea level rise are disrupted by Nutria. Once Nutria eat the vegetation, then there's a whole suite of other processes that then very quickly convert the vegetated marsh into open water. Nutria have now been eradicated from the eastern shore of Maryland, at least in Dorchester County, and I think throughout the eastern shore of Maryland. That's just something that's happened in the last few years. And so I look forward to seeing whether some of that marsh loss is reversible or not. I suspect in most cases it is not reversible.
I think we're good. Thank you so much, Dr. Kirwan. And again, happy birthday. And we will see everyone on Marine Science Day and again in June for our next after hours.
Thank you, everybody. And if you have any good stories or want me to see some of your ghosts for us, let me know. You can do a Google search for my email address, and I'll be happy to talk with you further. Thanks again.
Thanks. Bye.